Unit 9 is all about the age of imperialism, and you see the definition here in front of you, the domination of a stronger country over a weaker one. Make sure you understand that in many cases, imperialism means complete control, which would change the political, economic, and cultural life of those being taken over. So the question becomes, does the size of the country determine its strength? Absolutely not. Remember that Britain took the continent of America over, and look how small they are compared to the continent and the number of natives that were living here when they decided to colonize America. To set the stage for imperialism, let's talk about all these different revolts and changes, revolutions that are taking place across the world. We've talked about the Industrial Revolution, but there was also a medical revolution, the women's rights revolution, where women wanted suffrage finally. There were many massive changes taking place, but of course the one that is going to have shock waves that reach from continent to continent is going to be that Industrial Revolution, and it's going to lead to changes from coast to coast, country to country, types of changes that no one could ever have foreseen. Some of the other changes you might think are kind of interesting are women fighting for the right to rule themselves and make decisions for themselves, such as the lady in this picture here. This is 1907, first one-piece bathing suit for women in America, and of course she's going to be arrested for indecent exposure. Look at her, how dare she walk around like that? But there's lots of changes going on socially and worldwide as well. So, of course, the most dominating of the revolutions was the industrial one. We've already talked about that. And here is the snowball effect, as simple as I can get it for you. So the Industrial Revolution equals that increased competition worldwide. That competition is going to increase the nationalism that's already in place, which of course is going to increase the idea of imperialism, because as one country takes over new territory, every other large country decides that they have to take over something too to stay competitive, and it's that nationalistic feeling that kind of drives them to do that. So suddenly overnight almost it becomes in every country for herself. Overnight in the historical sense, so we're talking a pretty long time period actually. But how does that affect the countries who are taken over? Well, their trade is affected because European powers are going to force colonized countries to trade on European terms. So that idea of mercantilism, where these new countries that are being directly taken over by other countries can only trade with the countries who have just taken them over, or they have to give them a certain percentage of the profits, or just depend on which country it was. But believe me, the country doing the takeover is the one that's going to benefit from it. Industrial produced goods flooded these colonial markets and destroyed their traditional industries. Think of the little old lady with the spinning wheel that we talked about during the Industrial Revolution unit. That kind of person is gone in all the places that are going to be colonized, and they're going to open up factories in all these places, and tons of people are displaced. Family tradition type of industries that have been going on for a very long time suddenly gone. And then of course you have colonized people are going to resist, sometimes with devastating results. So their reaction can be something that leads to lots of death and lots of disdain for the country that's trying to do the takeover. In order to understand imperialism, there's three different types of imperialism that you really need to know. So a colony, here we go, make sure you're writing down the definition. A colony is a land controlled by another, often distant nation. And a colony is ruled directly by that dominant nation. And the best example I can give you is America. When we first came over here, we were colonies of Britain. And Britain directly ruled us by placing their own people in rule here for a very long time, and basically setting up the rules of the life of the colonist, the laws that they had to live by. So America was controlled by another distant nation, being England, and the colonies of America were ruled directly, or their government was actually the government of England. So that's a direct rule. where the government of this new land that's been taken over is the same government of the land of the country doing the takeover. So one more time, simplified. Colony means a land controlled by another, often distant nation, and a colony is ruled directly by the dominant nation. Now, a protectorate is a little bit different. A protectorate retains its own government, but it is a country whose government power and management is shared by another. So they share their government control with a more powerful nation, and in exchange, that nation pledges to protect them from invasion. So a protectorate actually rules indirectly through a government that is left in place. And of course we have places all over the world, such as Puerto Rico, that we do have an influence on their government. Their people are considered U.S. citizens, but we allowed their actual government to stay in place to the extent where they vote in our voting process, but they do not pay taxes in America, because that is an idea that the government of Puerto Rico came up with. So it was a kind of bargaining chip between us and the government of Puerto Rico. So we share control of Puerto Rico, but we are their protectorate. They do not have a standing military. We use them as a military base and a lot of other things, and voters, and they do buy a lot from us. So there is a trade-off going there, but we protect them in exchange for them allowing us to have a say in their government. So we share their government and we protect them. Now, a sphere of influence is a little more difficult to understand. It's an area of a country, just an area of it, not the whole country, just an area which is under control of another country. And this usually has to do with trading rights. And we're going to get into that a little bit more when we start talking about China. But basically, it's when a country goes in and leases a portion of another country in exchange for the trading rights within the territory that they're leasing. So say Great Britain went into China and leased a sphere of influence. Within that sphere, the Chinese that live there would have to follow the trading rules of Britain rather than China. So that's kind of how it works. You're leasing a section of territory from a country. Motives to imperialism are basically the same ones they always have been. Natural resources. Because it's the age of industrialization, though, this is focused mostly on things like coal. Imperialism is also about places to serve new markets and to open new markets to increase trade. The idea of Christianity is a very, very old justification for taking over another territory. We'll spread the idea of Christ. We'll save the heathens from themselves. And now you have this new thing on top of it, nationalism. Countries want to be the biggest and the best. It's us versus them across the world. So it is going to be a race for land. You can see the different territories, different countries that started this imperialistic move. And if you click one more time, you can see this is like where they're interested in. If you click one more time, you can see what they actually got and how in depth it became. So all the countries that you see that have a color are countries that were taken over by another imperialistic country, and you can see very easily that France and Britain are at the head of the game here. We were still a very young nation when imperialism really hit full force, not quite ready to go out into the world and start taking over other places quite yet. So let's look at some examples of imperialism. And this is just a cutesy little cartoon that you can see what the United States has fought for, you know, just a little cutesy thing. This is what we're going to be later when we do become imperialistic. Let's look at Ireland first. Now, Ireland was conquered by Henry II of England in 1171. And since that day, the people of Ireland have been heavily exploited by the people of England. And one of the things that I have to tell you about, because it is a perfect example of how ever since 1171 the English have really come down hard on the Irish, and they're still fighting this huge battle today over who should control Ireland and should English control be completely removed from Ireland. But It starts in 1171, and basically, whenever England had people that they didn't want inside the British territory, they exiled them to Ireland. And part of them, of course, sometimes they're going to be Catholic, sometimes they're going to be Protestant, and it leads to that mix of religion in Ireland that had not existed before. But you also have them controlling the markets. England controls the markets of Ireland early on. And when we talk about the potato famine of 1848, everybody gets the idea that the potatoes just didn't grow in Ireland, that there was this huge blight and all the Irish starved. That is not true. It was a bad year for farming for everybody, and England also had a very bad year, and they were afraid that they would start having a problem with feeding their own people. So because they were controlling Ireland, they went into Ireland just as a preventative measure for their own people in Britain. They went into Ireland and stole all the potatoes that did grow. Now, there was a shortage, not enough to cause a famine in Ireland, but the British came in and took them all, what did actually grow, and that's what leads to the potato famine. It's that combination of it wasn't a great year, and the English came in and stole the potatoes from the Irish, and Irish people were actually starving to death because of it. So you have not only the starvation thing going on, and this is 700 years later. After the takeover, they had been exploited all this time. They were constantly being influxed with either Catholics or Protestants that were kicked out of England. So they were kind of the dumping ground of England, and it ended up that the religions kind of split into territory, and the Catholic Southern Ireland Southern Ireland is where most of the Catholics are going to settle, and they're going to resist English control. But the Protestants are going to end up being settled in the north, and they want to be part of Great Britain. So you have these two different religions on the same island. Not only are they a different religion, which is going to put them against each other, but one wants the British involvement to stay, the other one wants the British involvement to be gone. So Southern Ireland and Northern Ireland hate each other. So just keep that in mind. The Irish wanted home rule. They wanted release from Britain. They wanted to control themselves independently and make their own rules. And Ireland is saying no. And remember, this goes all the way back to 1171, and it's still going on today. So it's a really big problem. Now, in modern times, the arguments between the Catholics and the Protestants of Ireland is going to come to a head on January 30th, 1972. So this becomes known as Bloody Sunday. What happened was Catholic Irish, mostly students, had decided to come to the city of Derry, which is in the north, so it's a Protestant city, and these Catholic students decided that they were going to come to the north to protest many things, but one of the big things that was upsetting them was the fact that college students who were Catholic were paying more than Protestant students. So this was very upsetting. So these kids mostly kids decide that they're going to go to Derry and have a peaceful protest. So of course, whenever the Catholics and the Protestants mingle in Ireland, it's a kind of a touchy subject, and things get out of hand sometimes. So a lot of policemen showed up to make sure that things did not get out of hand, and the policemen are of course Protestant, and the policemen and other people, Protestants lining the street, started saying nasty things to the Catholic kids, and the Catholic kids threw rocks, and then the police gassed them, and then the Catholic kids start throwing bigger objects, and before you know it, the police are completely ready to fight and kill people, and they fire their guns into the crowd, and they end up shooting. They actually shot more than 30 people, but 13 will die, and all 13 ended up being college kids, so they're young, and all 13 are shot in the back. So you're going to see a video in a minute of what was shown to the public, and it really does look like the kids are the ones that started the entire thing, and the police were simply defending themselves. And if all you ever got out of this was the video that you're going to see, the police might have gotten away with it. But of course, reports are going to come out that all of the children that were killed were shot in the back, which means they were leaving. They were done with the argument. They were leaving. and they ended up being shot in the back. So you can't come back from that. Bloody Sunday is the reason that England got scared enough to finally give Ireland home rule.
In the Northern Ireland city of Londonderry, a Catholic civil rights march is underway. Tension in the area between Catholics, Protestants and the British Army, specifically members of the Parachute Regiment, had been growing for weeks. The civil rights protest was turning into a riot as more and more Catholic youths began to shower the security forces with stones, petrol bombs and other missiles. The troops opened fire, the crowd scattered. When the shooting stopped, the casualties were counted. 13 Catholics dead, another 17 wounded. As the shock of it all began to take hold, it wasn't long before that sad day became known as Bloody Sunday, another date in the Irish calendar of tragedy, another setback on the road to any prospect of peace.
So today you have the Irish Free State. They were eventually given home rule. There's still lots of issues today. The British version of home rule isn't always what it really should be, and the Irish and the Irish Catholics and the Irish Protestants still hate each other. The North still wants to be attached to the United Kingdom. The South says we want nothing to do with it. Still just this ongoing problem when you exist on the same island. So the Irish Free State, as you can see, is much bigger than the northern part of Ireland that goes along with the United Kingdom, but still the North is a force to be reckoned with. I included this just so you can kind of see how crazy it got. So 1888, graves in Ireland. The Protestant is the wife, the Catholic is the husband, and when they died, they were not allowed to be buried in the same cemetery because cemeteries in Ireland are kept separate for Catholics and Protestants. But their children wanted their mom and dad to be at peace beside each other in death. So their children had this built for them. So mom is on the Protestant side of the wall, dad on the Catholic side, and then they have the hands joining so that they are still side by side to rest beside each other forever. I just thought that was very endearing and very indicative of the argument that's going on still today, that, you know, a Catholic and a Protestant can't even be buried next to each other, even though they lived their lives together and truly loved each other. So that just says a lot. That's why I put that picture in there. Let's talk about imperialism in Africa. So imperialism is actually going to begin in Africa with the Suez Canal, which I will come back to in a little bit. But I want you to know that that's the starting point. That's the jumping point. Britain decided that they wanted to take the Suez Canal from Egypt, and that starts the imperialism in Africa. So that's the catapult from which everything else happens in Africa, and it's some pretty bad stuff. So just know that imperialism practiced in Africa was different than the version seen in all other places of the world. This was one of the first cases where the government of the invaded lands were replaced with the governmental structure of the invading lands. So it was truly colonies where they Britain and France and Portugal and Belgium just moved in and either killed everyone in government position or imprisoned them, or just simply removed them and replaced them with people, members of their own parliament or monarchical rule. Now, previously, lands were taken over as a means to increase trade. That was kind of the idea of imperialism. But in Africa, the people were really too poor to buy much. So imperialism just became all about saying, I have this much land, our country has this much land. So it became a game of who can grab the most goodies, and Africa ended up being the prize. And it's going to lead to some very bad incidences in Africa and some very bad treatment of the indigenous populations there. So the world is going to let this happen, but you have to come up with a reason why. You can't just say, hey, we're going to go in and we're going to take over all these poor people and here without any justification. So they actually came up with two different reasons to justify besides I need trade markets, because that's not going to happen here. Two justifications, and the first one is slavery, believe it or not. So by the 1860s, when this becomes imperialism is starting to be the really hot thing of the day, much of the world had outlawed the slave trade. Even America wasn't doing slavery anymore. 1865, it was over with. But Africa was still using slavery. Protestant missionaries would go into different parts of Africa and come home and write articles and books about the horrors of slavery, and they kept it very much in the public eye. So the public was led to believe that European rule could actually end this tragedy. Like they're the ones to go in and say, we're going to get rid of slavery in Africa. So it became a moral justification. The truth is that slavery was never used in Africa like it was used in other parts of the world. Slavery in Africa was usually a sentence for a crime. Sometimes slaves were people captured in battle, but most often it was a punishment for a crime. It was not an ownership deal like it was in America. No human owned another human. Nobody looked at them as if they were subservient because of a different color. It just was not the same thing. But Europeans had come to associate the idea of slavery with human ownership. And they went into, the missionaries went in to save these people, and of course they needed public funding to keep making these trips into Africa. So the worse they made it sound, the more money they would get to go back to Africa to do more good. So slavery became one of the major justifications. A second one, and one of the really big ones, is a man by the name of Leopold II. He was the ruler of Belgium. He was often called the Butcher of Belgium, and he sent people in to claim Belgium's piece of Africa in 1876, and it was along the Congo. Leopold II made a huge show of this claim and did it with such brutality that the world sat up and took notice. If you did not do his bidding, as you can see in the pictures here, if you didn't do the bidding of Leopold by whatever he asked you to do, each little community was given an order along the Congo that, this community had to raise so much food, this community had to dig so much silver, whatever it was, whatever order you were given, if you did not fulfill the order, he would chop off your hands. So you can see in this picture here that the men are actually holding human hands. And that kind of became the sign that you were from the Congo eventually. If you were missing a hand, oh, you must be a Congo dweller under Leopold II. So he had people take pictures of this. Remember, photography is coming alive in the 1860s. So there's legitimate pictures of what Leopold is doing, and he's not ashamed to show the world. He wants the people to know the lengths he's willing to go to, because he thinks that it will instill fear in people and they'll just let him keep grabbing up land in Africa. But many countries, particularly France, really feared that Belgium would become a huge international threat if they were allowed to take over giant portions of Africa. So suddenly it became a race to stop Leopold. So that's how they presented it to people. Leopold is a crazy lunatic. If he takes over all of Africa, what will keep him from taking over the whole world? When I think of Belgium, I think of waffles and chocolate, these peaceful little people. But Leopold was not a peaceful little chocolate waffle eater. He was a very nasty man that had goals of taking over the world. So this was a perfect excuse for leaders of the imperialistic countries to move into Africa to grab the land before Leopold. So the two excuses are going to be Leopold and slavery, and that's their justification for moving in to Africa and grabbing the land as quickly as possible. I told you if you were a citizen living in the Congo that it was pretty easy to identify you, and you can see here that even children were missing a hand. If you were left-handed, then he would cut your right off, and vice versa, so that you could still keep working, but that was your punishment. If that didn't work, then you might lose a foot or an ear. He would make sure that you were still able to work for him and complete whatever task he gave you. And on the right hand side, you see one of the posters that were distributed internationally to convince people to get rid of King Leopold, to fight back for the Africans. And you see the African representation there at the bottom, like they're satisfied and happy, and here's Leopold hanging with a foot missing and a hand missing. And so those imperialistic countries were going in and doing a great thing for the Africans. That was kind of the mentality of this poster. So you can see the different areas of Africa that were taken over and claimed by 1883, and it became known as African fever. It was like the gold rush mentality, if you want to compare it to something. So very competitive, and during this time period, it was basically you just sent in representatives of your country with little flags, planted the flag and said, this belongs to France, this belongs to Britain, or whatever, and that was kind of the end of it. And European leaders started to get a little bit worried that there might be some issues with that. And make sure before you click to the next slide that you see where Leopold was there in the center in the orange along the Belgian Congo. So he did actually get quite a bit. Also notice the two territories that are in gray, and we're going to talk about those on the next page and why those were not colonialized by anybody. All right, so it literally became called the Scramble for Africa. And I told you that the leaders were a little bit worried about what was going to happen if you just went in with a flag and started planting the flag and claiming it for your country. So they had a conference in Berlin in 1884. And in order to, what they did there is they set rules for colonizing. And the weirdest thing about it, and the most insulting thing about it, was that there was not a single African leader invited to the conference in 1884, not one, even though it was about dividing up Africa. And not only were they not invited, they were forbidden from coming. So keep that in mind. Now, 1884 is when the Berlin Conference was held, and I'll give you some more details about that conference in just a minute. But know that within 20 years, all of Africa was colonized by imperialistic countries except for two parts, Liberia and Ethiopia. And the reason for that is Liberia actually had some trading connections with America. Now by 1884, we're not a superpower yet. We're not really ready to go out and start imperializing. I mean, we just weren't ready yet. We had gone through a civil war not too long before that, trying to rebuild our country. But we did have trading ties with Liberia, and we were a force big enough to make European powers kind of stay away from that. So Liberia was not colonized because they kind of saw it as ours, even though we didn't really colonize it. We just had trading deals with them. And then Ethiopia was a Christian country. It had been Christian all the way back to the Axum Empire, a very long time ago. They turned to Christianity, which was kind of their demise. But even when they left the territory, the people in Ethiopia remained Christian. Now, their version of Christianity, very different than the version that all of us know. Theirs is kind of voodoo-ish. They carry crystals. They do all kinds of ceremonies to ward off evil spirits. So it has a lot of voodoo in it too, but it still carries the title of Christianity. So how do you can't use the excuse anymore that you're sending in people to Christianize the heathens, because Ethiopia is Christian. So it was left out of it as well. So those two very, very tiny places and poor places, both of them pretty poor, were left out of that scramble, which makes them kind of unique. Now let's talk about some of the rules. The idea of, you see here, effective occupation was created at the conference. Now the funny thing about this, and I guess you could call it it's just odd that they decided to do it this way. They actually held the conference in the home of Otto von Bismarck of Germany. Remember, he's the one that created the idea of realpolitik, the ends justifies the means, and created that war about nothing between Germany and France just to unite the German municipalities. So that right there tells you kind of the mindset of this conference. So effective occupation meant that you couldn't simply put a flag in the ground and declare the land for your country. That wasn't enough anymore. According to the new rules, a country had to enhance the economic development of the area that they claimed. They had to actually create an economy that was making money. That sounds great because it sounds like the people of Africa are going to start making money. They're not. That simply means that you have a limited time as an imperialistic country to move into that new territory, rape the land, enslave the people, get something going in a very short time period that shows that you can make money off of that area. So it's still all about making money, and it left devastating effects behind. So keep in mind, there's very few friendly takeovers in all of Africa, and an entire continent was just terrorized by imperialistic countries, and what happened there was a sad thing. So let's go back to the taking of the Suez Canal. We said that this was the very first thing, very first move of imperialism in the country, and it starts with the canal building prior to 1869. In 1869, after 10 years of work, financed by the French and Egyptian government, then it's finally completed. So it had been in the process of being built for a very long time, and lots of countries looked back at this canal, or were watching this canal being built with envy in their hearts, you know, that it was the French that had joined forces with the Egyptians to get this canal built. Because think of what this canal could do for trade and military power. It instantly became strategically important because it links the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean very, very quickly. So again, it's going to increase trade profits by cutting down travel time, and it's definitely going to help European powers govern their foreign colonies more effectively. Think about Britain now, instead of going all the way around Africa to get to India, which they had a huge control over, they only have to go through the canal from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and boom, they're right there. So they can definitely control the colonies a lot more effectively. Now, in 1875, as a result of debt and financial crisis, the Egyptian ruler was forced to sell a lot of his shares in the Canal Operating Company to the British government. Britain had been begging for a part in this for a very long time, and the Egyptian ruler needed money. Britain was willing to offer quite a bit, and the British ended up with 44% of the shares in the canal, with France and Egypt sharing the remaining amount. So Britain actually had the controlling shares at 44%. Whoever has the most shares is the boss. So France no longer holds the majority, Britain does, and Britain was very happy because it allowed them better control, like I said, over India by cutting 6,000 miles off that trip to go all the way around Africa. So a really big deal for Britain to be able to control that canal and to be able to decide what countries were allowed to use it and what countries were not. Now in 1882, Egyptian nationalists were getting tired of foreigners in their country and telling them who's allowed to come through the canal, and they revolted. So Britain sent an army to put them down. Britain was very successful very quickly. They officially named themselves the Protectorate of Egypt, whether Egypt liked it or not, and the Protectorate of the Canal Zone. So now they're officially a Protectorate of Egypt, and they will actually share in the government of Egypt. Remember, that's a definition of a protectorate. They'll protect Egypt, but they share the government, which means they can basically tell them what to do. Britain even replaced the Khedive with one they personally selected. So the Khedive, of course, is the head person in Egypt. He was replaced. Britain is going to keep a really heavy military presence in Egypt until 1956. So all the way from 1882 to 1956, Britain kept a very large military presence, a large amount of troops along the canal zone. So a very long relationship between Egypt and Britain, not a friendly one in most times either. Let's talk a little bit more about imperialism in Africa. Again, Britain is one of the bigger forces, so we're going to talk about them a little bit more. Once Egypt was under British control, they kind of felt like, let's just keep on moving down the coast. So eventually they're going to take over Sudan, which is right under Egypt. You can see it on the map here. So it's right along the Red Sea, it's right above Ethiopia, and right below Egypt. So they just figured, let's just keep taking them down. And by the time that they got to Sudan, there was a brand new invention that was highly used called the machine gun. The machine gun had been used in the Civil War, but it wasn't highly effective yet. But by this time period, it is. So the British had imported tons and tons of machine guns and were well experienced by now on how to use them. So you have all these Muslims in Sudan who try to fight back basically with spears, and they're fighting machine guns. Now, this is the part that really bothers me, because we always think of Winston Churchill as this favored person in history that did all he could to save the world from Hitler and bad things taking place. But Winston Churchill was actually a military leader during this takeover of Sudan. He was a soldier, one of the lead soldiers, and this is a quote that he said about the Sudanese Muslims that they were gunning down. And this is what he said: "These foreign figures march up one by one out of barbarism to the footlights of civilization, and their conquerors," talking about himself, "taking their possessions, forget even their names, nor will history record such trash." So Winston Churchill, who's supposed to be a good guy, was calling these people trash, barbaric trash, and saying that no one would ever even bother to record their names. So you can really understand here, if even one of the great leaders of the time period would say something that horrible and that debasing, that was the mentality of all Europeans basically at the time, to just take over the Africans because they were barbaric and needed to be taken over. So in the end of this battle, which was a very quick battle, the British left 11,000 Muslims dead. Only 28 British soldiers died, and many of them were accidental deaths, where during one of the charges a soldier fell off a horse and was trampled, that kind of stuff. So 11,000 Muslims versus 28 British soldiers. And needless to say, of course, the British is going to win that battle. Let's move on to Southern Africa. And we're going to talk about the apartheid there. The apartheid, you can compare it quite a bit to the segregation acts here in America. We were in full force fighting for civil rights by the 1960s, but their problem with the separation of races officially began in 1969 when the apartheid was legally put into force. And the apartheid was race laws that affected every aspect of life for South Africans. It provided whites with access to the most privileged suburbs, education, jobs, and positions, even to the extent of exclusive access to beaches, theaters, parks, bridges, public toilets. And it wasn't like separate but equal here in America, where if you had a theater for the blacks, you had to, or for the whites, you had to have one for the blacks. You just didn't have anything for them. Blacks were removed from major cities, especially beautiful cities like Cape Town. They were removed from their homes and put on reservations in very small houses. Most of them did not have running water or electricity. Children were banned from education. There were very few jobs for blacks. The system was ensured that white privileges were beyond the reach of blacks. Most of the jobs that blacks got were, if they could get one, was for working for the whites. Women in particular worked in the homes of the whites as nannies and servants. Very unfair type of system, and we will come back to the apartheid again in a later unit. But if you would click on the picture, you will be able to watch a pretty cool movie about the apartheid and get a better idea of exactly what was happening there. So see you on the next slide.
Today, all South African citizens live in a democratic society and have equal rights. However, for most of the 20th century, a political system that came to be known as apartheid assigned privileges and enforced laws based on race, keeping white South Africans separate from non-white South Africans. Black South Africans have lived with people of European descent since Dutch settlers began moving into the country in the 1600s. But white South Africans wanted to control the country. Beginning in the early 1900s, the government passed laws that established the legal segregation of racial groups, known as apartheid. Apartheid laws provided white South Africans with higher wages for the same jobs. These laws also evicted black South Africans from their land and made it illegal for black South Africans to travel anywhere without passes. Other laws prevented black South Africans from voting in elections and forced them to live on crowded reserves called Bantustans, which were located in arid and fertile areas. Without the ability to farm successfully, black South Africans became dependent on white South Africans in order to provide for themselves and their families. Many had to give up farming and work as servants or laborers. In 1912, black South African nationalists founded the political organization called the African National Congress to fight for justice and equality from the white minority government. ANC members included a small number of white South Africans who were sympathetic to the organization's goals. But their efforts made the government more restrictive. In the 1940s, the white minority government cracked down even more and extended the system of apartheid. Members of the African National Congress believed nonviolence and legal means were the way to fight apartheid. They protested unjust laws with marches, boycotts, and civil disobedience, the refusal to obey a law. But South Africa's white minority government fought to preserve apartheid through arrests, threats, and violence. Many white South Africans were not sensitive to the protests raised by black South Africans about apartheid. They lived in good homes, had well-paying jobs, and were free to travel wherever they liked. But for black South Africans, life on the reserves was a constant struggle. They held low-paying jobs and could not always find affordable housing or health care. Overcrowding made food and clean water scarce. Electricity was rare outside of the cities and suburbs where white South Africans lived. Many black South Africans were angry at their treatment by the government. They joined the African National Congress and protested for the end of apartheid and for equal rights. They tried to end apartheid by working to get the laws changed. In response, the government cracked down on both white and black people who opposed apartheid. Many white South Africans began to view black South Africans as dangerous terrorists who wanted to destroy both them and the government. But black South Africans said they were only trying to gain their freedom from an oppressive political system. Black South Africans suspected of being members of the African National Congress were often arrested and sent to jail. Some were murdered by South African police. The black South African struggle for freedom now included fighting for imprisoned members of the African National Congress, many of whom were abused and tortured in jail. Despite many of its members being killed or imprisoned, the African National Congress continued to exist in South Africa, inspiring others to fight for an end to apartheid. In the late 1900s, reformers like Archbishop Desmond Tutu would use the African National Congress nonviolent tactics to successfully bring about change. Archbishop Tutu would help expose the horrors of apartheid to the world. He would call for the end of apartheid, an end to the government ban against the African National Congress, and the release of all political prisoners. The struggle that the African National Congress began in 1912 would not end until the South African government finally rejected apartheid in 1989. Throughout the 1900s, the African National Congress was a leading force for civil rights in South Africa. Many courageous leaders, such as Nelson Mandela, worked to end apartheid, often at the cost of their freedom and their lives. Their legacy lives on in the African National Congress today.
Let us forget the past. Let us now work together to make this country a great country.
Did you know Black South Africans weren't the only ones affected by the apartheid system? South Africans of South and East Asian descent, as well as those of multiracial descent, were also kept separate from white South Africans.
So let's go to the British imperialism of India. We've already talked about this before, so it's just really going to be a review for most of you. If you don't remember it, take notes, but I think that you'll remember it. India, and because of the bad things that they did by forcing the Indians to have to work together, the Muslims and the Hindus to work together in the British military. Those were the sepoy guys. So British and Hindu Indians forced to serve in the military for the British were called sepoys. And by the middle of the 1700s, the Mughals had been so weakened that the major British trading company, the British East India Company, took the risk of sending in troops to take total control over much of India, of course, and it worked, and that's going to lead to the Sepoy Rebellion. So again, sepoys, one more time, is that that group of Hindus and Muslims forced to work together. And again, it's the British East India Company, which was led by the British officers that staffed most of the military and controlled the sepoys. Very fragile relationship every way you look at it between the sepoys themselves and the sepoys and the officers. And we're going to do a real quick review one more time of the disadvantages of British control. Don't forget that they removed Indian-owned businesses and took control of them. The British did. They removed the food crops and replaced them with cash crops, which led to insufficient food supply and famine. And then the missionaries moved in and damaged the belief system of the Indian traditions. Don't forget that all of this was based on that rumor about the bullet casings, that the British had purposely put bullets in fat casings that were pork and beef, which is against the religion of both the Muslims and the Hindus, and for them that was kind of the last straw. They weren't going to take it anymore, and the Sepoy Rebellion begins. Now, as you can see, it's going to last for 2 years. And of course, it's going to end in favor of the British in 1859. Many sepoy involved in the rebellion were executed by cannon. We already talked about that. And now this is 1859. India is not going to get her independence until 1947. So it's a very long struggle between the British and the Indians. Let's move to China very quickly. Now, the first goal you can see of imperialistic nations in China was to find something that these Chinese people might want to buy from other nations. China has always been the seat of ideas. We've talked about how silk and paper and porcelain and the compass and the printing press and just about any other invention you can think of off the top of your head actually started in China. Maybe it was perfected someplace else, but it starts in China. So they had the upper hand in trade for a very, very long time, and nobody could figure out what they could possibly want from another country until Britain came along. Britain decided that they were going to sell opium to China. So opium, if you don't know, is a very, very addictive drug. You try it 1 or 2 times and you just can't go without it. And Britain knew that. This is going to be Queen Victoria that does this. Queen Victoria and her husband Albert, who tried to control the world. We'll talk about them when we get to World War I. But they could legally grow opium in India. They were allowed to because it was their territory. And then they illegally sold it to China, kind of under the table. But they got it in, and it became such a problem so quickly that there are lots of documented ship logs that say that people pulled up to the ports in China, and the ports were literally just littered with people passed out. Nobody was working, nothing was getting done. Trade pretty much stopped for an entire year. Nothing was coming out of China, and they promoted it. The British promoted it in such a way that every age level was convinced to take opium before they realized how addictive it was and the damage that it was going to do. But it was advertised that you could put it on the gums of teething babies and it would make their gums stop hurting. So babies were addicted to it. Women were told that it would clear up your complexion. Elderly were told that it would help with arthritis. Men were told that it would help with virility. So every social class, every gender, every age group was somehow sold this idea of opium. And by the time that the country was literally falling apart and falling asleep through addiction, it was a thing that they could not get out from under without Queen Victoria's help. So the Chinese government are going to go to Queen Victoria and beg her to stop the sale of opium in China, and she agrees to with the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. And of course, Britain being Britain, oh, there's my alarm clock, just to introduce the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. I did that on purpose. But some of the aspects of the treaty you can see here in front of you, and the first one is the one that just kills me. China has to give Britain money, $21 million in silver, to stop the import of it. And then you can see that a lot of it has to do with just trade. They got an entire country addicted to drugs for trade. So a 5% fixed tariff at all the international ports. Any deal that China made as far as trade goes with other countries, they had to give it to Britain as well, no matter how good it was. Britain got the same deal. And one of the things that really upset the Chinese citizens the most was that the British in China were not, they didn't have to listen to Chinese law. If they did anything illegal at all in China, then they went to a British court and probably were most often set free, not punished at all, and just left to go about their normal lives. And the Chinese saw that as unjust. So all these things, including, of course, opening that door to trade, was the whole reasoning behind getting this country addicted to opium. How vindictive is that? But Britain certainly did a lot of stuff, didn't they? All right, so once the doors to China are open, countries all over the world are going to start pouring in. Remember, they've gone more than a year with no production going on. China is in severe economic straits here, and they needed to get more money coming in. You've got an entire country that was first addicted to drugs and not doing anything, and then you had an entire country that went through withdrawal together. So they are going to have their doors open, willing to lease parts of China to foreign countries. And this is where we get that term, the spheres of influence. The most famous case, of course, of the spheres of influence is China, because of the incidences of the Opium Wars and the actions of Queen Victoria. So once the doors are open, all these countries that you see start pouring in and leasing parts of China. America is not going to be in that mix. The only place that China refused to allow a sphere to rent was America. They did not like Americans. Now, if you look at the spheres, this is what was happening in each one of the spheres. If you rented a sphere, say you can see the ones from Britain. If Britain rented a sphere, all the Chinese people living in that sphere could only trade with Britain. Britain had all the trading rights there. But in exchange for doing so, Britain also had to build all the infrastructure needed in that part of China. Now, China, even today, is not highly populated in the western side at all. Most of their population is concentrated along the east coast, and they're a very poor country. So here was an opportunity for them. This wasn't just about getting money off of the lease document. It was also about creating an infrastructure of railroads and schools and roads and canals and hospitals and sewer systems. That's what the country, using the sphere of influence, had to do in exchange for the trading rights within those spheres. So anything that Britain needed, of course, to have successful trade, you're going to need all that infrastructure, and that fell on the financial side of Britain, that Britain would have to be the one to take care of it, or whatever country, whether it was Germany or Japan or whoever was controlling that sphere, they had to actually build the infrastructure. So in exchange for opening up and granting these spheres of influence, China got money that they desperately needed, but they also got a free infrastructure that is still in place today. So in the beginning, Chinese leaders kind of saw this as a good situation. The citizens of China are not all going to think that it's a great situation, and it's going to lead to something called the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. There was a group that called themselves the Fists of Righteous Harmony, but they went by the Boxers as a nickname. And the reason that they did this, that they were called the Boxers, is because they had this religious ceremony that they would perform, and they would stand in front of a set of lights and cast their shadows on the wall, and this religious physical ceremony that they held looked like shadow boxing. And according to their belief, at the end of this ritual where they shadow boxed their own shadow, they were impervious to bullets. So keep that in mind. So they're going to start this rebellion in 1900 because they were sick of all the foreigners being in their country, telling them who they could buy from, creating all these changes. It's not going on very well for them, and their goal is to get rid of all these devils. The devils and the Westerners, they wanted rid of them. So the Boxers decide that they're going to go to the city of Beijing, which was a very wealthy city in China at the time, and there was a part of Beijing that was walled off from the rest of the city. And this is where the important diplomats from all of these countries who held spheres would stay when they came to visit their spheres, or just to be a tourist. All these people would stay behind this walled part of the city of Beijing. And what better place to hold hostage, because they're already behind a wall. So the Boxers stood around the edges of the wall and just held them hostage. And the goal was to get the Western devils out of their country. They just wanted everybody to leave. And of course, it's going to lead to bloodshed. It goes on. It does go on for 2 months. So the Boxers really were the ones that ended up, most of them were killed. And I guess they just figured that as they watched the people beside them fall to bullets when they're supposed to be impervious, maybe they just thought that guy didn't do the dance right. I don't know. But they went on for 2 months, and the Boxers, of course, are going to lose. And they were facing every military across the world that had any diplomats in that walled part of Beijing. So you're talking all the civilized nations pretty much, except America, were here. We're in China to fight against the poor Boxers, who are going to lose miserably. And the dynasty, the Qing dynasty that was in control at the time, they were blamed by most of these imperialist nations, saying that it was a coup that they had instrumented. They had actually paid the Boxers, which was not true, but the Qing dynasty was destroyed because of it. And an ending result as well is something called the open door policy. Now, I told you America was not allowed in the beginning, but there was a man by the name of John Hayes, and he was a government official, Secretary of State actually, and he wrote letters to all the leaders of all the countries, including China, to work out a peaceful deal that China would not be overrun, would not be blown off the face of the map for the Boxer Rebellion, that they could actually have a peaceful settlement where there would be an open door policy, that all countries across the world would be allowed into China pretty much at will, without any kind of rebellions from the Chinese people. And of course, it's much more complicated than that, the deals that were made. But the powers across the world loved John Hayes' letters and agreed to this idea of the open door policy, including China. But there was a stipulation, of course, that John Hayes made with China, that America would now be allowed a sphere of influence in China because he had made this deal. And if China said no to America being allowed in, then he would withdraw those letters of advisory that he had sent to all the other countries and re-advise them to go after China and tear them apart. So that open door policy was finally extended to America, and all because of the Boxer Rebellion. So their rebellion did not decrease the existence of foreigners in their nation. It actually increased it. So on to Japan. Japan is a very unique story, and this is our last case of imperialism. Almost done. So in the 1600s, Japan looks across the world, sees what's happening, all these people doing exploring and clashing with each other, and they don't like what they see. So they decide they're going to adopt a policy of isolationism. They only allowed one port to be open in Nagasaki, of all places, which of course is going to be destroyed in World War II. Nagasaki was open to trade, the only port, and it was only open to the Dutch. So anything that they needed, they would buy from the Dutch, and the Dutch, if they didn't have the stuff that Japan needed, they would make deals with other countries, but they were the only ones allowed to bring a boat to the actual port in Nagasaki. Further, to increase this isolationist belief and motif, no Japanese were allowed to leave the island. So you can see this edict of 1635 was put into place, and the third bullet there says if any Japanese returns from overseas after residing there, he must be put to death. No questions asked. If you leave, you die. Very much like North Korea is today. So no one was allowed to leave the premises. They didn't want that foreign influence in their country, and that was just the end of it. They weren't willing to negotiate that. Now that's going to stay in place for all the way from the 1600s till 1853. The world kind of left Japan alone. We didn't know what was going on there. We kind of picture them as these backward little tiny people that couldn't hurt anybody anyway. So let's just leave them alone until 1853. There was an American by the name of Matthew Perry. He was a Commodore Matthew Perry. And basically he just pulled up alongside Japan, sent a contact ship to the port at Nagasaki and said, if you do not open your gates, whichever one I choose, open your ports to trade with the United States, I'm going to blow you up. And that's called gunboat diplomacy. So he threatened to blow them up. And he wanted Tokyo open. Back then it was called Edo. You don't need to know that, but it's EDO. Today it's Tokyo. Matthew Perry demanded that they open the ports at Tokyo, and they did. Not much of a fuss about it at all. Japan did not have a huge military at the time. They really had nothing. They were very isolated from the world and didn't really feel a need for a giant military. They just wanted to be left alone. And when Matthew Perry showed up, they had little choice but to open their gates. So Matthew Perry and his gunboat diplomacy, threatening to blow them up, was, that was just it. That's all it took. So they opened their gates. So Japan, unlike other countries, didn't just fold to imperialism. The Japanese have always been really, really smart. And once they realized that they couldn't fight the gunboat diplomacy, they didn't have a military that was strong enough, they decided to kind of go along with these Westerners. And their goal, unbeknownst to the Westerners, was to become just like the Westerners and then beat them. So even today, the Japanese are very adamant that their children leave school very well-rounded. Even if you do not have an artistic bone in your body, you know how to draw very well when you leave. You know foreign languages. You know how to play an instrument. You know math. Even if you're not good at it, they make sure that you leave that school a well-rounded, very capable individual, and they've always kind of thought outside the box. I mean, in the 1970s, when we were having economic issues with gas prices and things like that, they turned to electronics. Nobody else had thought about doing that. So they stayed afloat. They were one of the few that did not go through the Depression, did not go through the hard times in the 1970s. They've just always kind of been one step ahead of us since they opened those gates to Matthew Perry. So they decided that they were going to have to become imperialistic themselves. Matthew Perry did not come to take them over. They just wanted trading to happen between Japan and America, and they didn't fight back. They said, come on in, we want to learn from you, and unbeknownst to everybody, get better than you, and then they themselves are going to become the imperialistic ones. Very smart people. So Japan, in a very short time, remember they're taken over in the mid 1800s, not taken over, but they had to open their gates to Matthew Perry. By 1894, they had Korea and Taiwan. They took both of them away from China. And then in 1904, they just kind of started this impromptu war with the Russians in Manchuria. The Russians now, this giant country, 50 years after Matthew Perry asked them to open their gates, they have this huge military, so huge in fact that they actually beat the Russians and took Manchuria away from them. And Manchuria is well known for diamond deposits. So now Japan has lots of stuff to deal with. They have Korea, they have Taiwan, and now they have Manchuria. They have become an imperialistic power that the world has to deal with. So America, what is she doing during all this time? We're not moving into tons of places yet. We were being very strategic about the places that we took over. Ours was more about trade than it was about how much land can we own. So we kind of missed out on that grab for Africa, that scramble for Africa. But the islands that you see circled here were strategically picked by our leaders so that we could get to the Asian world if we ever needed to. And I mean, we did. We went to Japan with Matthew Perry in the 1850s, but we were also looking for what might happen in the future, that we needed to have control of places that we could stop with a boat, and then eventually later on we'll stop there with planes too, to refuel and resupply. So that's why we needed Hawaii, and that's why we needed Midway and Wake and Guam and the Philippines. That's the places that we took over very strategically, like stepping stones to get to the Asian world. Samoa has a lot of minerals there that we wanted, so we kind of sidestepped and took them over. And then here in our part of the world, of course, we took over Cuba until Castro came along. We still have a relationship with Puerto Rico, and then the Panama Canal Zone. Teddy Roosevelt helped the helped the Panamanians run the Colombians out of there. So these are just some examples of our imperialism. They're on a much smaller scale than Britain or France, but they're much more strategic than Britain and France were. So we're pretty smart too. With everything we've talked about in this unit, if you want to just see a picture of it, there's a video that's about to play that will show you the changes that took place across the entire world, and you can see those changes by the changing of flags over different areas. So you don't have to watch it, but it's kind of cool and it's not very long. So once that's over, the unit is done, and I will see you in the next unit.